I'm joined today with one of my former students, Josh Pelletier. Josh was in, I think, two of my classes, Scripture and Apologetics Implications and the Philosophy of History. And he currently leads a Ratio Christi group at Charleston Southern University. And he, as one of my students, he wanted to do a master's thesis. And so I suggested some topics to him. He chose one, and he just did a fantastic job. And I want to be able to have him share with you some of the research and conclusions he found. He's going to pursue it further in a PhD. But hey, Josh, great to have you here today and to discuss such an important topic.
Thank you, sir. Glad to be here.
Great. How was your experience at Houston Baptist University?
My experience there, I really liked it. The way that they did the online format, I think was very well suited for what you do in apologetics. Apologetics, you have to be able to pick up a book on your own, read it, understand it, and explain it. And the way that the students and faculty are, they still communicate with you even after you've graduated. I don't know that in any other school I've ever been to so far. And so I've had an all around good experience being part of Houston Baptist.
Well, that's great. Well, you were an excellent student, and I was blessed to have you in my classes. So you did your master's thesis on some prolegomena pertaining to the Gospel of Mark. So tell us a little about your research, and we'll get into some specifics, but tell us a little bit of the process that you did.
Well, originally I was taking the scriptures implication class with you, and at this time I was trying to figure out what I was going to write my thesis on, and it just so happened that you presented an idea about you were interested in what the majority of scholars had said on the dating of Mark. And after some time, you asked me to go ahead and take on that research project. And it started off with looking at what majority of critical scholars say on Mark's dating, his source, such as was Peter connected, and authorship. And I took on a fourth topic, the origin of Mark's gospel. And what had to be done was we started at a date of 1965. 1965 until present is the sources that were sampled, and the sources, the person who authored those sources had to have a PhD or something equivalent in the relevant field of New Testament studies. And the sources I used had to also be published during the lifetime of that author. So if there was a reprint and that author had died, I couldn't use it. I had to find the one that was printed while he was still alive. And because I'm not able to translate French or German or any other language yet, all sources that were used were sources that were written in English language.
How many scholars, individual scholars, were included in your survey?
I sampled a total of 207 scholars.
207. So we're talking about what we're going to be discussing here for these three episodes, these three videos, is where critical scholars are. Critical scholars, they have a PhD published in the relevant field of New Testament studies, and where they stand on these four subjects, 207 of them since 1965, writing in English. Is that correct?
Yes.
I mean, it's not exhaustive, but it's a pretty robust sampling. It should
Yes.
yield a pretty accurate assessment of where critical scholarship stands today on these issues.
Yes.
All right. So in this one, we're going to be discussing the dating of Mark, the dating of composition. When was Mark written? So before we get into that, why is the Gospel of Mark important?
Well, it seems like that until the rise of form criticism, the Gospel of Mark was neglected. Some of the reasons that scholars have suggested is that there's barely any new info that's not found in the double tradition. So you look in, especially Matthew's Gospel, you got pretty much all of Mark in there. Tradition also seems to hold that Matthean priority. so that's why maybe Mark was neglected. And the historical Jesus interests is where really the Mark kind of got some into the spotlight. So Ernest Best claims that Mark was a neglected gospel until the 19th century. During that century, there was a complete turnaround, and by its end, the shortest gospel was receiving the greatest attention. This came about through the rise in interest in the life of the historical Jesus. So, because of the historical Jesus studies, Mark started to receive a little bit more attention. Essentially, Mark is also important because it may very well be the key to solving this synoptic problem. And if Peter is Mark's source and it's written first, William Barclay is correct when he says, quote, Mark is the nearest approach we will ever possess to an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus, end quote.
So let me ask you this. All right, almost all scholars today agree that the Gospel of Mark ended abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8, where the women have gone to the empty tomb. An angel has announced to them that Jesus has risen from the dead. He's no longer there, and that they are to go tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus has gone ahead of them into Galilee. They are to go there, and there they will see him even as he told them, referring back to chapter 14, verse 28. So that's where most scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark, the original Gospel of Mark, ended, the one that we have today. And the verses 9 through 20, where it talks about picking up deadly snakes and drinking poison, that they'd be okay, that is all spurious, that was added later. The original ending of Mark was either ended right there at verse 8, or Mark was either unable to complete his gospel due to sickness or imprisonment, or the original ending was lost. So the whole thing about the ending of Mark, does that play into how scholars date Mark?
That's a great question. Actually, it seems like the majority of scholars, they actually talk about the dating Mark and they talk about the long ending of Mark in a separate category. And so their dating is not really influenced by what they think the long ending of Mark is. If they think it's on the autograph, then obviously they think that it's to be dated. At the same time, they think that the autograph is dated. If they think it's later, then they think it's some sort of interpolation. But speaking on the long ending of Mark, I think it's important to discuss something I found. Dr. James Snap Jr., I've never seen any of his work cited in any of the sources I've read, but he has a study that you can find on Amazon, where he basically goes through these claims that the church fathers supposedly didn't know about the long ending, or that majority of manuscripts don't have it. But in his research, he kind of refutes those claims, and he basically says, quote, out of 1,640 Greek copies of the Gospel of Mark, only 3 Greek manuscripts in the text 16 verse 8, and only 2 of them are early. And so I thought that was very interesting. And I know that there are going to be people who disagree with him on his view that the long ending is on the autograph, but I thought it was interesting how he brought to light about how a lot of church fathers did in fact know about this long ending, or at least they alluded to it, and the manuscripts seem to show that it might have been on there.
Okay, now let me ask you this. I remember recommending this research project to you, and what prompted it was a New Testament scholar named Rafael Rodriguez had posted on Facebook that, when was Mark written? Something like that. When did we think Mark was written? And I remember saying that I think that most scholars think that somewhere between the years 65 and 70 was the average. And so a bunch of others were chiming in. I remember Mark Goodacre chimed in, and they agreed that they thought that's where the majority of scholars were, between the years 65 and 70. But I don't know if anyone before you did this who had actually did a bean count and had actually looked at where scholars are. It was just a hunch that we had. So, but there is a range of dates. Some like to date Mark quite early, and some will date him quite late. So, what is the range? What's the earliest you've seen that scholars have dated Mark? What's the latest? And yeah, what's the range of dating?
So the earliest date I found for the Gospel of Mark was AD 33, and that scholar, Dr. Wan, this was in a dissertation, so he's a PhD person. He says AD 33 is 62, so his earliest date is AD 33, and then Robert M. Price, he's open to as late as the third century. So we have pretty much Jesus dying, and then Mark writing, and then Robert Price, who thinks that Jesus could have died in the BC era, and then Mark wrote way later on.
Wow. Wow, that's a huge range.
Yeah.
And wow, AD 33. Did you read that dissertation?
I read most of it. I did not read the whole thing, but
Okay.
essentially, he's kind of just like looking at the eschatology and the epistles, which have a stronger dating foundation, and he's using that as a limit to what Mark could be, and then he's putting it as early as 33, but he can't get anywhere uh, more fine tuned than that.
Gotcha. Tell me, what is fragment 7Q5?
All right, so at the time that they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was the Qumran Cave 7 discovery, and there's archaeological evidence that this cave was never disrupted since 8068. So this fragment that was found there, the 7Q5, some scholars had thought it represents Mark chapter 6, verses 52 for 53. It seems, however, that modern day scholars, or at least recent scholarship, Robert Stein writes about this, is that they think that it's actually representative of one Enoch.
Ah, okay. Well, that's pretty cool. Yeah, and First Enoch is it's quoted by Jude, the letter of Jude in the New Testament. It's kind of interesting. Um, so, do scholars don't typically use it to date Mark?
Well, it would be the ones who think it's a Markan manuscript. So they would say, well, since this site was not disturbed, then it has to be at least 8068, and it takes time to write the thing, so you gotta push it back. And if you hold a Markan priority, well, that goes back even earlier.
Gotcha. So, all right, what are some of the arguments for an early date of Mark? Let's say pre 70, 70 being that date when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. So, what are some of the arguments given by scholars for a pre 70 dating of Mark?
All right, so out of the 207 scholars, 98 of them have a pre-70 dating, a 70 to or earlier dating. And some of the arguments have to do with the whole Mark, Luke, Acts relationship. So Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. Acts comes second, so necessarily those have to be dated. One has to be dated earlier than the other one, so Luke was written before Acts. And then if Matthew also used Mark, this will also would end up pushing Mark back. So depending on what you think that the double tradition Acts are written will influence what you think or how you can date Mark. So there's that sort of relationship. There's also patristic testimony regarding Peter. So if you think that the church fathers are trying to tell you that Mark wrote during Peter's life or after his death, you have really a dating range of starting around somewhere in the 60s, essentially. And then there's lots of datings with Mark 13, a lot of disputes. Scholars use the German term that sits im Leben, which in the context of biblical studies, it has to deal with the situation of life. And so there's various arguments to try to show that Mark 13 represents, this time of conflict. So they might talk about the Neronian persecution or Caligula or something like that. and so that's used to try to date before 80, 70 time frame.
Would you say those are the top three arguments that you used for pre-70?
Yes, those are the top ones. You see a lot of scholars relying on the church tradition pretty heavily. They don't seem reason to dispute it, especially with Papias, because if you have Papias, the first one, and then he's also got the guy John he talked to, so he has his own source, which means that's an even earlier sort of person he's talking to. That gives you some strong evidence that Mark was written early.
Okay, but Papias, he wrote somewhere between the years 100 and 150. I think the majority of scholars today place Papias around 130. I think he's probably within the first decade of the 2nd century, given what Eusebius writes in his calendar of events, but of the Olympics, the Olympiads at that point. But let's just say 130. And Papias says that he got his information from an associate of one of Jesus' actual apostles, John, whether it be the John the Elder, be John the son of Zebedee, or a minor disciple of Jesus. I know that's disputed, but that means if he got it from an associate of one of Jesus' apostles, and Papias says he got it while that apostle was still preaching, that means Papias received that information sometime in the latter part of the 1st century. So that would seem to rule out Price's placing Mark sometime after 200. Did you say when did you say Price puts it?
You said sometime in the 3rd century.
In the 3rd century, yeah. Wow. So anyway, so you have sometime in the latter part of the 1st century that Papias receives this information about Mark writing the gospel, and that he got his information from Peter, which we'll talk about later. But that doesn't mean pre-70. That could still be post-70, right?
Oh, if he got his information from Peter?
Yeah.
Well,
isn't there a dispute? I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but is there a dispute? Are there conflicting accounts with the early church fathers pertaining to whether whether Mark received information from Peter while Peter was alive or after he died?
Yes, there seemingly is. So it appears that when Papias writes, and scholars will dispute this, but my opinion is that when Papias writes, he's writing as if Mark is writing while Peter's alive. And then you get to say Irenaeus. That's where it gets disputed a lot, because the Greek word exodon, I think I'm pronouncing correctly, it either means departure or death. Another scholar said it means departure and death. So did Mark write before Peter died? And that could be depending, the date for that could be depending when you think Peter was in Rome with Mark. That's what Irenaeus talks about. And if he wrote after the death, well, you still could get before 70 because Peter died under the leadership of Nero, and Nero died in the 60s. And in fact, Kim Tan, he says that no matter what you think about the inconsistencies, that the range of AD 64 to 68 will still be a range you could easily get, no matter how you deal with the discrepancies or how you review it.
Okay. All right. So you've talked about the top three arguments that are used, top three reasons for thinking that Mark was written pre-70. What about the top three arguments that it was written after 70?
Well, there's quite a bit. There's a lot of it has to do with, I think, disputing the patristics, basically saying, oh, we can't trust this thing. You know, these guys, they were just making things up, blah, 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 blah. There's the issues of Mark 13 again. So Mark 13 can be used to try to date a before 70 as well as a after 70. There's John Shelby Spong has a unique argument, and that's what a lot of these post 70 arguments are. They're primarily unique. He talks about how there are two different Jewish tribes, and one Jewish tribe basically put the death of Jesus on their hands, And so the Romans went after and killed them, and they were able to get away from it. And because of that setting, it puts it after 70, because that's when the Romans were killing the Jews. You have Christopher Zeichmann. He talks about the denarii and how that wasn't in circulation, and the people, the audience that Mark was writing to didn't pay taxes either. And so he dates Mark no earlier than August 29th, or excuse me, 29 August of 71, because that's when Vespasian came into power and they started paying the taxes. You have Kloppenborg. He does an argument about the, hopefully I pronounce this correctly, the Avocatio Deorum, basically the evoking of gods from the temple before the Romans would destroy it. And then he says that Mark knew about this, and so at least part of his writings were post 70. And there's also second century arguments. I can go through some of those too if you like.
Yeah, why don't you mention maybe the top one used for the second century?
Top one, I would say it would be Helmut Koester. I think that's how you say his name.
Helmut Koester?
Yeah, Helmut Koester. He believes in the secret Mark priority. So that whole controversy with the secret gospel of Mark, it's believed that if it's according to their writings, it sounds like the secret gospel of Mark actually comes after canonical gospel Mark. But he's saying that he thinks that the secret gospel of Mark was Mark's source, essentially. And because it's a second century writing, it had to be the canonical Mark had to be written in the second century.
And many, we just say here, many scholars today think that Secret Gospel of Mark was a forgery that was created by Morton Smith.
Yeah.
And I think 1959, something like that. I forgot the exact date, but so I haven't looked into it enough to make a judgment. I think Craig Evans in Fabricating Jesus, in that book, I think he argues that it was a forgery by Morton Smith.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. The majority of scholars believe that it's some sort of forgery, whether it's Morton Smith himself or someone later on in history pretend to be Clement of Alexandria. And Morton Smith really did found this thing, but it wasn't authentic.
Gotcha. Now you mentioned Mark 13 a couple of times. Just now, this is Jesus' Olivet Discourse, in which he's predicting when the temple is going to be destroyed and the second coming and things like this, right?
Yes.
Okay. So now let me ask you a question. There'd be a number of evangelicals who would say that there is a bias among skeptical scholars against, let's say, Jesus' ability to prophesy the future that would involve a supernatural event. And that's like a major motivation behind dating the Gospels late. But I've looked at, like you have the argument, I think it's like the number one argument or one of the top three arguments you gave for an early dating of Mark. So Acts ends with Paul in prison, and I think it was Felix, who is the Roman governor at that point. And he comes into office, 61, 62, something like that. So you've got Luke's gospel written before that, and Mark would, if we go with Mark in priority, which most do, you have it before that. And Acts doesn't mention the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So that's an argument that I hear a lot. But you've got evangelicals and conservatives like Craig Keener and Ben Witherington who are willing to date Acts post 70. They don't find that argument compelling. What in your survey of what critical scholars since 1965 have said, do you see such a bias that kind of bias of which they're accused? Do you see it at all? Do you see it? Is it just somewhat present? Is it broadly present? What do you think?
Not dating things because they don't want to commit to a prophecy.
Yeah.
I've seen a couple scholars talk about how prophecies are not true, or that Mark was just purely writing fiction. I think the majority of scholars who do a post 70, they start off by attacking the patristic data, um, but I don't see too much of a bias, honestly, at least not admitted.
Okay. So talk about, you've mentioned the patristic data. Anything else that you can throw in about that?
I would say that as Christians and people who want to do honest scholarship, when we look at the patristic data, and no matter what we're looking at, whether it's has to do with the different claims of maybe where Mark wrote the gospel, whether it be Rome or Italy or Alexandria, or if we're trying to figure out did Mark write during Peter's life or afterlife, we have to be honest and admit things that might be incorrect, just like we do with theology. And my opinion with the patristic data is Papias is the strongest piece of evidence we have for it, and that's where we have to start with.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people would attack Papias, and I can understand that. I think it's the fourth century that there was one of the early church fathers that who mentions that Papias reports a story about the death of Judas, how he got really fat, so fat that he couldn't open his eyes and couldn't fit between a door. And when he urinated, worms came out, and he died of that. And the stench of his corpse was still around to that very day. People didn't want to go to where his body was. And they said, well, if this is the case with Papias reporting such a crazy story, how can we believe him on anything else? And I have to admit, I mean, it's a troubling story. You look at that though, and you say, well, but that could have been an addition to Papias. Papias may not have written that part. We are looking at some writing from the fourth century. I'm not saying that's the case, but that's always a possibility. But let's just say Papias did write that he took a story that was passing around and it wasn't credible at the time, or at any time. It just wasn't a credible story. That would, show that his what he reports about authorship is not unimpeachable for sure. But then I compare it with other things. So, for example, Plutarch is regarded as the finest biographer in antiquity, and he wrote just after the time John is believed to have written. So at the end of the first century and up to about the year 120 and shortly thereafter. And the best evidence we have, the earliest evidence we have, that Plutarch wrote the lives. He wrote over 60, of which 48 have survived. The best evidence we have that Plutarch is the author of those is the Lamprias Catalog, which scholars date anywhere from no less than 100 years after Plutarch wrote to as many as 200 or even longer after Plutarch wrote. And it's pseudonymously attributed to Plutarch's son. And it also includes literature attributed to Plutarch, which classicists are very confident Plutarch did not write. That is our best and our earliest evidence for the authorship of Plutarch's lives. And yet, Christopher Pelling, the leading foremost authority on Plutarch, he retired a few years ago from Oxford. He's a classicist. He has told me that he's not aware of any classicist who would question whether Plutarch wrote those lives. So, agreed. I can agree with scholars that Papias' testimony is not, we would wish for better. Like if we're holding a hand of cards, we wish that the cards we had were better. But then when we compare our hand with what is there for, say, Plutarch and some others, we find that our hand is pretty good in comparison. So if you're going to reject Papias on the account of what is alleged that he said, alleged to have said by a 4th century author, well, then you're going to have to throw out the authorship of Plutarch as well. So Okay, so let me ask you. Let me ask you two more questions here. You mentioned how some scholars date Mark into the second century, and you mentioned one of the arguments for that, what Helmut Kerster argued. Any other any other arguments? Are there any arguments that you think are, they carry some weight that Mark wrote in the second century?
Uh, Not really, honestly.
Okay.
The I mean, okay, I'll say this. There's another guy, Marcus Vincent. He wrote about second century. He does Marcion priority, that the Gospels use Marcion's gospel as their source.
Wow.
Uh, yeah, I will say that I'm not persuaded by his argument, but his book he wrote is pretty impressive. He didn't just throw something together. He really um, critiqued stuff. So I would say that he definitely put some work in, but I'm not persuaded by his arguments. And like I said, the church father stuff is what these later dating guys hold to, and like kind of like you're saying about Papias, there's ways to view it. There's different ways to view it. One of the arguments that these scholars will say is that, well, Papias says that Matthew was written in Hebrew, but that's not true. So therefore, this other stuff he said's false. But that's fallacious reasoning, and there are things to work through in relation to that. You could say, well, maybe Papias got that wrong, or instead of it being the Hebrew language, maybe he was writing a Hebrew sort of style or framework. And then some scholars think that Papias' quotes about Mark's gospel and Peter was being circulated, and they get that from the way the Greek is written. And some scholar, at least one scholar, thinks that it was Peter himself who said that quote. And they go through some of the Greek grammar and show, like, look, Peter's the one that's actually saying this. Papias wrote it down. Eusebius didn't question it, and whoever else used Papias' as source didn't question it either. And it's not like if this was a saying that was going around town, someone would have disputed it, and it should be on record somewhere.
Yeah, in terms of, I know that D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo, in their New Testament introduction, they think that Papias just got that wrong, that Matthew originally wrote in Hebrew, which when he says the Hebrew dialect, with many scholars, take that as probably he's referring to Aramaic there. And I know Carson and Moo, I believe it's their New Testament intro where this is where they mention this, and they say, well, if he was wrong on Matthew originally writing in Hebrew, that doesn't mean he was wrong on Matthew writing it. I find that kind of ad hoc and a weak response to that. In terms of the Hebrew style, the Aramaic, uh, it Papias, when you look at it, what he says there in his fragments, he is not saying that Matthew wrote a gospel in Aramaic. He is saying that Matthew wrote the ta logia, is the term in Greek, ta logia, which means the sayings, the teachings. And so he's not saying he wrote a narrative, he wrote the sayings or teachings there. I think it's very plausible, quite plausible here, maybe even probable, that Papias is referring to the Q source, because the Q material, which is sayings material common to Matthew and Luke, but absent from Mark, with only three small exceptions, it's all sayings or teachings of Jesus. It's not narrative. So I think this is what Papias could have been referring to, that perhaps Matthew took some notes of Jesus's teachings while Jesus was still alive, therefore wouldn't mention his death or resurrection. It's his teachings, it's sayings literature, and that is what was originally written in the Hebrew dialect, in Aramaic. Later on, Matthew has a secretary, an amanuensis, who, under Matthew's supervision, that amanuensis composes a gospel based primarily on Mark as the source, and supplements it with the M material, special M material, which was material, additional eyewitness testimony from Matthew. And then Matthew has the secretary translate the talagia, the sayings of Jesus, into Greek. And so we have that in Matthew's gospel. Now, that may not be what happened, but I think it's, you know, to discredit Papias' statement based on saying that Papias is mentioning the Gospel of Matthew originally written in Hebrew, and yet everything that we have appears to show that Matthew was originally written in Greek. I think that's a bad argument that's easily neutralized for a more plausible explanation for that, meaning that Matt is referring to the Q material. And therefore, Mark could have been written first in that way. Matthew came second, but the Q material, this talagia material, originally written in Hebrew, may have come before Mark's gospel. What do you think of that?
That's pretty good. I didn't see anyone else say that.
Well, Dale Allison
Okay.
and Davies in their commentary on Matthew with the International Critical Commentary series, they suggest that that's a very plausible option, and I know a number of other scholars have as well. Darrell Bach, Craig Keener have looked at that, and some others have looked at that as some possibilities. So, all right. So let me ask you this, Josh. All right, you've done this study with 207 critical scholars writing in English since 1965 on where they stand on the dating of Mark. And you said out of those, I think something like 94, 98, however many you said date it pre-70, which would be just under 50%. What other categories do you have? Where are the majority on this? If it's just under 50%, that would put it pre-70. Is there a greater percentage than 50% who put it post-70?
All right. I'll go ahead and now try to clarify all this. So 207 scholars represents sources that were total sampled and at least wrote on one of the four categories. So sometimes there was a source that didn't have dating, for example. So if I were to remove the silent category, silent being a scholar who didn't say something about the dating, since that's what we're talking about right now, or maybe they just alluded to saying majority of scholars say X or Y, then the total amount of scholars who spoke on dating is 160, and that's still 98 scholars. But that goes up to over 60% of all scholars have
all right, I'm sorry. You said 160, and that's 98 scholars. What do you mean 160? What's that number?
All right, so 207 scholars were sampled, right?
Yeah.
And the sampling was considered a usable source. A source was considered in a sample if, as long as they spoke on one of the four topics that we talked about earlier.
So how many actually spoke on and opined on the dating of Mark?
160 of them.
Okay. All right. And then out of those, there were 90 some that.
Yeah. So
okay.
We still keep the same 98 scholars. What we lose is where the scholars were either completely silent on dating, or they just made, they just alluded to saying something like majority of scholars say this dating. I didn't count that as a personal opinion. Gotcha. I just wrote down personal opinion. So 160 scholars, which would represent 61.3% or just over 61%, hold to it dating 80, 70 or earlier. And then when you compare that to the next two categories, which is around 70 could be when a scholar just says around 70, or say they do 50 to 75. I still count that as around 70 because it crosses 70. Or the third category would be 70 or later. So that could be 80, 70 to 71 or 80, 70 to third century. So 98 scholars, 61%, a little over 61%, hold to a dating of 80, 70 or earlier. And only 31 scholars, so 98 to 31, that's a little over 19%, hold to a dating around 70. And then the same thing with the post 70. It's only 31 scholars, again, about a little over 19%, hold to a dating of 80, 70 or later. So this is a huge difference where you have 98 scholars as compared to just 31.
Wow. Yeah, that's huge. That's huge. That's like a 2-to-1 ratio.
Now, as far as more specific datings, uh, if I go with the 207 sort of population, we have, and it should actually work with the 160 as well, but from 80, 70 or earlier, the biggest sample in there is in the 60s. So it's 20.8% is in the 60s. The next biggest one is 5.3, which is 50s to 60s. And so what I came down to was that I think that majority, if you look at it really closely, it's going to probably be about 65 to 70 would be where majority of scholars stand if we keep honing in.
Wow. So what we have suspected, what many New Testament scholars have just suspected without doing the bean count, 65 to 70 turns out to be what the majority of position is today.
Yeah, and let me clarify, actually. It's 20.8% for 60s, and it's actually 60s to 70s is 6.3, and then it's 50s to 60s 5.3. So yeah, it's before 70, and then if you try to fine tune, it's probably in the mid 60s to 70s is where a majority stand.
Gotcha. Wow. So, well, that's interesting. So, one thing we can take away from this is from your research, a robust sampling of critical scholarship since 1965. That when you say where are they on the dating, it's by a 2-to-1 ratio,
Yeah.
right around a 2-to-1 ratio of pre-70 versus post-70.
Yeah.
Interesting. Did you do anything in terms of, did you look at where trends might be? Like, is there a trend in more recent years, let's say since the year 2000, perhaps, like in the last 20 years, is there a trend to go toward later dating or earlier dating?
So in the beginning of my thesis, I kind of wrote this sort of survey. This is where I included the majority of scholarly opinions that scholars would write down. And so one scholar in the 70s might say, oh, majority of scholars say Mark was written in the 60s. And then for some reason, a few years later, you have another scholar giving a totally different range. And they weren't like completely different, but they were kind of like, they weren't the same either. And actually, your source I took, your article that you wrote on, was one of the newer sources, and you had questioned if scholars had actually checked their work, and you were thinking maybe as early as maybe the 50s to 70s, or you said something to that extent. And that's,
yeah, I had only looked at I think 75 sources at that point, and it seemed 50 to 70 was the category out. But you've done a lot more work since then.
Yeah, and that's it still would be sort of true, because if you remember the sampling, those are the largest categories in the 70 or earlier. It starts as early as 50, which is the second highest, to the 60s and 70s.
But you say the 50s and the 60s would be what you said, 5% or something like that?
Yeah, so 50s to 60s is 5%. The 60s was 20.8, and the 60s to 70 was 6.3. So if we were to start kind of on the lower side but higher in comparison to all the other ranges, it starts at the 5.3 in the 50s to 60s. Then it's a huge chunk in the 60s, and it starts to go small again in the 60s to 70s. So it kind of peaks in the 60s somewhere, and that's why I say about 65.
That's pretty cool. Well, thanks so much, Josh. This is great work that you've done. We'll be interested to see the work that you do in your doctoral research to expand that list even further. Maybe include some other languages, whatever. But 207 critical scholars since 1965 writing in English. That's a robust sampling. And I know you did a whole lot of work on this, and it took you a while. So in our next video, we will be discussing another issue of the Prolegomena related to Mark, and that is authorship. Who wrote Mark? We'll be looking at the evidence and the arguments that are used by these critical scholars since 1965 writing in English, and I look forward to that. Josh, thanks so much for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.